Mhm.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's Family Connection. CHKD presents Coping with Loss. Our presenters this evening are Reverend Ann West Kessner, the chaplain and bereavement coordinator for Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. Joining her is Olivia Vincent, certified child life specialist, also with Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. And now I will turn the presentation and the screen over to Ann and Olivia.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here tonight virtually with you guys, and I'm going to see if I can share my screen with you. Okay, all right, I think I can do this. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I know that this is not a light topic. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for logging on. Thank you for being able to listen and to be present. I'm so grateful to my friend and colleague, Olivia, for being here with me. She is very wise in her role and in her skill as a child life specialist. And I feel as if you all will glean a lot of great information from not only her, but hopefully this presentation. And in case I forget to offer this at the end, if you have any additional questions or any particular scenarios that you might need to work through, our services are available for community use as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out and to let us know how we can be of service to you and to your children or children that you are around. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. I can get the screen. share. Here. There we go. It's just a little slow on the uptake there. All right. So before we begin, I'm hoping that you all can just join me in a minute to just reflect, to take a deep breath, and we're going to do a little bit of mindfulness activity. Again, this is a very deep and loaded subject and topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a breathing exercise. So when I tell you that we'll begin, we will inhale, as you can see, for 4 seconds. If you want to focus on this image, close your eyes. If you want to focus on something else or play music, you can do that. You will hold for 4 seconds, and then you will exhale, and you will hold. And then we will come back and talk about how to cope with grief and loss. So let us begin. Breathe in and hold for 4 seconds. And exhale for 4 seconds. Thank you. So our title today deals with grief and loss. And typically, when people ask me what I do, I'm often shown the facial expression that goes something like this. Oh, and many people don't know what to say for grief, loss, for bereavement. And so it is also my hope that through this presentation, you will be able to feel a little bit more comfortable having that conversation. So what is grief? And what does grief mean? Grief, loss, bereavement, these are all terms that we throw out. Death, dying, and also many people are afraid to talk about death and dying. So the question then becomes, is grief only related to death and dying? And I wanted to push you guys just a little bit and talk a little bit about how grief and loss how it can translate into other scenarios. So grief and loss often are associated with death and dying, but there is also associations with sorrow, with sadness. When we speak about loss, it doesn't necessarily have to mean the death or the dying of a person. It could be a thing. It could be a moment. It could be a block of years, milestones. It could be the loss of, let's say that you went into preterm labor. It could be the loss of the pregnancy that you wished that you had had. In regard to a relationship that you had wanted to flourish. It could be the loss of a relationship or the loss thereof of one that you had hoped to have. And grief often follows with that sense of loss. Now, grief doesn't always mean deep down in the murky, muddy waters. Some of us can go from our day-to-day experiences in grief and nobody would know any different. So grief looks differently and it manifests differently for every person. And then we go into the psychological aspect of what is grief and loss and how does that affect us? And then also how does it affect those around us? Without going too much into that, I would like to mention too that the way in which we often deal with grief and loss is in relation to our own family systems. How have we experienced grief and loss in our families, whether immediate or generation to generation? And how are we also promoting that, or maybe not promoting that at all, to our children or children that you might care for? For example, and you'll probably hear me give lots of examples. I'm an open book, so you'll probably know my life story by the end of this presentation. But one of the examples that I always like to share is, so when you are younger, when you are maybe in your teens, And you really start to think about the concept of death and dying at a greater degree than you would at 4 and 5. You rightfully so go with how your family has navigated grief and loss. So my family, for example, was very solemn. It was very quiet. It was very personal. I remember my first experience with death. It was one of my grandparents. And I just remember everybody coming together and talking about my grandfather. We had lots of food. I remember that. I remember that. Everybody gathered around, told stories. But the theme was often solemn and for the most part quiet. We didn't cry in front of each other. We had to keep it going, and we had to put on what I like to call a face. How are you doing? Oh, we're doing good. Thank you so much. And we didn't have the experience to talk about our feelings, or at least not to my knowledge at all. So I'd like to encourage you guys, when we talk about this with our children, with your children, to follow their lead. And Olivia, I know we'll talk more about this later, but I didn't know if you wanted to add something about the different ways that we experience grief and loss.
Yeah, so like Anne was talking about a little bit, my role kind of goes along with her. So I work with explaining really the whole medical aspect to kids, but as well work with kids in understanding death and dying. And one thing I want to express the most is that every kid grieves differently. So you may read online that kids grieve one way and your child grieves another. So there's all kinds of ways. Like I've seen kids that laugh when they get the news because it could be an anxious thing. They could not understand. I've seen kids immediately crying. You ask them why they're crying and they can't answer you. I've seen kids get angry. So every single kid can react to grief and death and dying differently. And it's just really important. They may react differently than you did or how the sibling did. So just remembering that it could be different no matter what their age is or if they've experienced death or dying before. So.
Right. Thank you, Olivia. Absolutely. And I think at many periods of age, kids look to us to figure out how to grieve. The only way that I knew how to grieve was to look at my parents and my grandmother. The other part too is if you're not talking about death and dying, perhaps it's the loss of mommy and daddy's job. Communication is key. And I think you'll hear that over and over and over again. Appropriate communication with your child at their age level is key. And so some of the tools that Olivia will help us glean are those tools later on. So let's just back up a minute and talk a little bit about reactions to the event. For this particular slide, I am going to talk about death and dying. We want to talk a little bit about our reaction. So as adults, what is our reaction to the event? And for this particular case, we're going to talk about death. What does it evoke in you, in your spirit? What does it bring you back to? Those emotions, if left unresolved, we call that unresolved grief, can impact and often do impact the way in which you are handling the present grief, the present death or news that is before you. So it's very hard, but it's also very key that you understand where your grief is coming from, whether that be 10 years ago with unresolved grief, with the loss of, let's say your husband. And the other key point too, in this form of grief is recognizing your grief and allowing it not to dictate or to enter into somebody else's grief. And that's a very difficult thing to do, but the more that you're aware of it, and also the more that you talk about it with somebody who can be there for you, is very important. So these are just some questions that I wanted you all to think about on your own. It doesn't have to be during this presentation, but maybe in your alone time. Death and dying and grief and loss don't necessarily have to be happening to you right at this moment. I think eventually it will come in some form or another. And the more that we're able to prepare for these conversations, the more that we take away the awkwardness and the more that we kind of bear ourselves to allowing these feelings and emotions to enter into us can be very helpful for a healthy, supportive relationship, not only with your kids, but also with your partner and with yourself, but also your family. As we all know, there's 5 stages to grief. However, many people think that you have to go through them chronologically. That's the misconception. Grief does not look like a straight line. It is a spider web of emotions, and you can go from, bargaining to depression to feeling encouraged and energized. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. And that's true for children too. We can help by guiding and by preparing the way and by affirming how they feel. Also recognizing if it's going too far, if their grief needs professional help. I think that's another piece too that sometimes we don't like to consider, is when maybe we can't handle the grief ourselves enough, and we need to look to somebody who's a neutral party to help discuss those things. The 6th stage of grief, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about that. It's David Kessler. He worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he has written a book called Finding Meaning. And I have really enjoyed reading that book because I think that missing piece of the grief journey is often what we hope to find somehow, some way. Doesn't mean it's going to happen after you read the book, but at least we know that we are searching for some kind of understanding or some kind of resolution, or at least, I won't even say peace, but at least, being okay with understanding a piece of that. Olivia, did you want to add anything to that?
Not yet.
Okay. Yeah, Olivia's knowledge is going to come much later. And I honestly could not do my job without her. And I think that's key too for being a guardian and for being a parent. We don't have to be everything in that regard to our kids. Sometimes it's okay to let a therapist or a counselor or a friend, as long as you talk with that friend, help to uncover these feelings, help to be a safe and like a safe person and a safe response. And it's also good to hear different viewpoints as well. Of course, I can hear some of the parents right now being like, oh my gosh, I don't want, as long as the parents are okay with it. So this image right here is actually how grief works. I'm sure many of you are nodding your head like, oh, yes, absolutely. Common fears when you are grieving, death and dying, you're not in control. You might appear weak, like you don't have your stuff together. You should be over it by now is often a common fear too. It's often a common mishap as well, that it should only be 0 to 6 months and then we're good. Another common fear that I often see with children too, which Olivia had mentioned earlier, is the fear of being happy, the fear of being joyful, or the fear of really not caring in that moment. The great questions and prompts to bring up with your children. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the adult world. Olivia is going to share a little bit about the child and teenage world, and then we'll continue on, and we will leave some time for some questions. So again, what I was talking about earlier, adults just as well as children can have a very hard time understanding grief and loss and death and dying and all of those big words that are very scary and nobody wants to talk about. However, the more that we process, and whether that's a verbal process or an internal process, I think the more at peace we are with how to understand death and dying. In terms of losses too, also being able to reflect and see patterns of where your life has been and where your life is going and where you hope that it goes. And whether or not we're happy in that moment or not, at least we can dictate where we have come and where we want to go. So for many adults, this takes dedication, and it takes a long time. It takes a long time. Again, I want to share a little story. I remember when I first started going into the role of grief and bereavement. I had been in chaplaincy for a couple of years, and I was working in the neonatal intensive care unit, and I just felt drawn to being in that unknown with families. I think it's a mind shift. And one of the things that I always like to tell people when I'm talking about grief and bereavement is that we often think of it as something that's very, very scary, something that's very dark, something that we don't want to have any part of, right? But there becomes a mind shift where we have to look at this as saying, okay, this is part of life. Now, whether we like it or not, that's something completely different. But this is a part of life. This is a part of the life cycle. How can we shift and start to find meaning, start to find hope, believe it or not? How do we find, I won't even use the word comfort, but how do we find space to just be in that like muddy, sticky, dark place? How can we just be present? And that is what the shift looks like when you start to say, okay, I'm in this moment. I have just lost my partner. My child has just lost their father. You know what? I'm not doing good today. What is one thing that I can do, or one thing that I can say, that I can put one foot in front of the other? And if it's just that one thing for that one day, for that 1 minute, take it. That's the shift. And again, it's so hard. And I'm not really an expert on all things, because again, it's different for everybody, but that is something that I think is universal, is recognizing, yes, I'm not doing okay in this moment. I might not be able to find hope in this moment, but how can I put one foot in front of the other, or even just stand still and make sure that I provide the least that I can provide, just to be present and understand what I'm feeling. Olivia, if you don't mind, I also have, Olivia, I have your other screen. Would you like me to go to that screen? Okay.
Yeah, of course. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about is how kids understand at each age group what death and dying is. So the first stage obviously is infants. So infants understand that adults are in their life and that they can feel like that they're sad or angry, but honestly, they don't understand or realize that a person's not there anymore. So for infants, it's not like your parents are gonna need to explain anything. It's just making sure that infants still get those 3 basic needs, that they're getting fed, that they're in clean clothes, and they have like somewhere safe, somewhere comfortable to live. Preschoolers. So the big thing with preschoolers is they may see that death is reversible. They may think that, I'm going to use like a grandparent, that grandpa passed away, but it's okay because he'll come back. So one of the hardest things about preschoolers and even those elementary school kids is you may have to tell them 6, 7, 12 times, grandpa's dead. And what you saw on that first slide was using an honest approach, using the words dead, dying. Those are really, really important, because if you say grandpa's sleeping, well, when they go to sleep at night, they wake up in the morning. So what's really important with that preschool and even that elementary school age is that it's honesty with all of them, but really with those two. Preschoolers, again, they think that it's not a permanent solution. They think if you say grandpa went to heaven, grandpa went to this place, they think they can go visit that place and that they can come back. So it's really important that they understand that grandpa's not here anymore. We can't go visit him and see him, and that they understand that the honesty of that. With elementary school age children, they understand that death is a permanent thing, and they understand some of them understand like how the death occurred, but one of the things is that they think death only happens to other people. They don't think it's going to happen to them. They think that grandpa dies and grandma dies, but that it's not going to happen to mom or dad, brother, sister, or themselves. So it's really important with those kids that they understand how the person, the family member passed away, and that it did happen to them and that it could happen to other people. So that when they hear at school, oh, Susie's grandpa passed away from this, and oh, my grandpa passed away from this, you don't want kids to be like, no, that's only a thing that my grandparent passed away from. With those middle school age children, they really do start to, that's when children really grasp a little bit more. I wouldn't say until high school they fully understand death and dying, but middle school, like they're almost there. They understand what it is. But some of the things are a little bit harder with the middle school age children to understand. One of the examples is if an adult goes into a cardiac arrest, meaning their heart stops beating. Middle school age children have a hard time understanding. So they stop breathing, which they a lot of times associate with is like their lungs, because they're learning about their body, but their lungs were still breathing, but they may have seen CPR, or they may hear it and see that we're pushing on their chest to make their heart beat. So middle school age children have a hard time understanding the why something happened and need a lot of reiterating of this, like I call it like an A plus B equals C. So a lot of times I have to explain car crashes to kids, and it's the car hit the pole, so-and-so's head hit the tree, and because of that, we can't use our brain anymore because the brain got hit by the tree. It sounds really bad, but it's honest, because they need to understand that if at any point in time they're in a car crash, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to die, because they could think every time they get in the car that they're going to get in a car crash and they're going to die. So it's really important with those middle school age children that they really do get the full honest story of what happened. With high school children, like I mentioned, they have a full understanding of death and dying. They understand that it's final. They understand how it can impact their life and others. One of the things about high school age children is that they're learning about themselves. So they're learning how to cope with things. So they're really trying to figure out, okay, I just found out that somebody passed away. I see that mom is grieving this way, dad is grieving this way, my brother's grieving this way, and they may not know and try to adapt to those different ways to grieve, but it may take them a while to figure out how they need to grieve. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my other screen really quick.
And I will add, while you're pulling that screen up, Olivia, too, as hard as it is for us as adults to utter these words, it can be most helpful for many of the children at any of these age ranges to say, I know that it's hard to understand and to hear this, but Sue's heart has stopped beating and she is dead. Those are very hard words to utter. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes it's really hard for us working at the Children's Hospital too. I mean, you're not alone. Because like Olivia said, you don't want to say that they have died without reason to understand how they died, because it does look like they're sleeping. And so for many kids, when they see that somebody has died, they do fear going to sleep, and they associate it most of the time with older people. And the more that your child grows and develops, there are many other ways to die. And that's when you have those conversations at your pace about whether it's overdose, whether it's by violence, whether it's an accident. What do accidents look like? But the bottom line for most kids is safe to say, so-and-so's heart has stopped beating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of us can't stress enough how important it is to be honest with them. So those are kind of like how each age understands death and dying. One of the first things I do when I go into a room with a sibling, if another child has passed away or if an adult has passed away, I ask the kid, so tell me what you know about the situation. The first thing you want to do is find out, what do they know? What are they thinking? Because a lot of kids know a lot more than we think they do. They've heard conversations. And so we may be trying to walk on eggshells around a new diagnosis of cancer or a car crash, and then you sit down and you say, okay, so what have you heard that's happened? And they'll say, oh, well, grandpa got in a car crash and he hit his head. And you're like, okay. So I always start with, what does the kid know? Because they will guide you through the conversation. Ask them, what do they know? What have they heard that happened? Do you understand why so-and-so's in the hospital? Do you know if they're at the hospital with you? Why are they here? Why are you here at the hospital? And then I kind of take the conversation from there. Again, I can't stress enough to be honest and tell them exactly what's going on. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying if somebody had an injury that was very gruesome, that you need to go into details about the gruesome injury, but just being honest that there was an injury to so-and-so's head, and therefore they're not alive anymore.
Right. So like pertinent to their developmental stage.
Yes, I definitely don't recommend if there was any like type of like, it's just crazy, just awful thing that you don't want your child to know. Like, you tell them what you want to tell them. You know your child best. Just be honest about it and try to avoid, like Anne was saying, they're sleeping, or that, you know, you want to put a reason that they're no longer alive. One of the other things is, and I said this a little bit earlier, is that the kids, no matter what age, maybe not high school as much, but they may ask around Christmas and birthdays and family gatherings, hey, like, where's grandma, grandpa? I keep using grandparents, but where is grandpa? Like, they're not here. Where are they? And I know that can be hard as a parent to have to revisit that and say, remember, like, grandpa died. He's not here anymore. He's not going to be here. That is very hard, but very important for that preschool, elementary school age to understand that death is permanent.
And Olivia,
I mentioned,
oh,
yeah,
sorry.
of course.
I'm loving what you're saying. The only reason I want to jump into is platitudes. When you say he or she's in a better place, or God called them home, or the Spirit has welcomed them, or I actually would recommend avoid using that unless it brings your child comfort, unless that's part of your spiritual background, only because that vagueness, right, can kind of confuse most people, because then they wonder, well, why is God taking somebody that I love? Or why does the Spirit have to call this body home? That's not fair. I want them here. So Olivia, you just reminded me of that. People might say that off and on. And sometimes you as a parent also are like, I don't want to hear that again. Like, I don't want to hear that one more time. So recognizing that for your children too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but kind of going back to it, kids, especially younger kids, even the high schoolers, they're not sure how they want to grieve yet. They're looking at their adults or looking at their siblings. Something that's very important is try not to force an emotion on a child and say, well, aren't you sad that this happened? Instead, asking them, what are you feeling right now? Like, and give them examples. Are you feeling like you want to cry? Are you feeling like you want to smile? But like, don't let them put words to their emotions so they can tell you what's going through their mind, because you could be shocked. I had a kid tell me one time, I'm really happy that grandpa died. And I said, okay, well, tell me about it. And they said, well, he seemed like he was hurting, and now I know he's not hurting anymore. And the parents at first were very scared that their child was saying they were happy. But then when I kind of dug a little deeper, the kid understood a lot more than any of us were expecting them to know was going on. And they were happy because grandpa wasn't in pain anymore. And that's okay. That's an okay emotion. Going along with that, a lot of kids will not talk about how they're feeling, but they may show it. They'll show it in their play. They could show it in like older kids in video games. So younger kids a lot of times will just start playing. And if nobody's like paying attention to them, I hear them like, yeah, so my grandma died today. And like, they're playing with like dolls and stuff. And like, you can hear exactly what they're thinking through play, but you may have asked them 10 minutes ago and they're like, no, I'm fine. So a lot of times I just sit back and watch and let them go back to that normal routine. For a kid, the change in what's happening in their normal everyday routine can really throw off like how things are going for them. So getting them back into the normal routine of going to school when you're ready, and then going to daycare or after school, whatever it may be, a lot of times they express how they're feeling through that. And then I think I mentioned everything. Again, like older kids express a lot of it. I see a lot of older teenage boys, like adolescent males, they get on their video games and like they don't think anybody's listening, and they'll be talking online, and you'll see anger come out, or you'll see them like using their online people to like express it. So even though they're older, don't think they still don't express their emotions through play.
Absolutely. Thank you, Olivia. That's incredible advice and hard to take in, because as a parent or a guardian, you have to deal with your grief in addition to most likely your children. And I think the instinct for many parents is to be in control and to help everybody grieve, right? But the ironic part about grief is if you don't address your grief, then it can sometimes impair or impede your children's grief, because they're looking to you too to have permission to cry, permission to be angry, permission to be okay, permission to be happy, and that can change every single day. One of the things that I love to recommend to many families, for any age, and sometimes it's hard with teenagers, but it's kind of like a coloring book, a journal, and you can take that into many directions as you want. So let's say that you have a bonfire one summer night, and everybody writes down how they're feeling, and then you go around the circle and you tell each other how you're feeling, and then you just put it in the fire, and then you're like, okay, does anybody want any s'mores? Taking it step by step, feeling your family, feeling out what they're comfortable talking with. If they're not comfortable talking, make sure that they know that they can have somebody else to talk to. Whether that be a counselor, a therapist, a friend, and of course you want to instill healthy boundaries. I think the other portion too that we think about too is if we're a friend to another friend who just lost their child, what is our role? And I think the advice for that question is ask them. Do not be afraid to say their baby's name, their child's name. Do not be afraid to say, I don't know what to say. Space and time they're good too, in the sense though that you don't want to leave too much time unattended, because you don't want them to think that they're forgotten or that their child's forgotten. Many families who are grieving, whether it's the loss of a child or a spouse, do need that period, whatever that may be, to get their feet somewhat on some kind of ground. But also, after a month or two, to just check in and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I thought about Mark today. And just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Sometimes when I call families, I often say, how are you feeling in this moment? Because our routine is to say, hey, how are you doing? And the answer could probably be like, really, really bad. I'm having a really bad day. Okay, tell me about it. Tell me about those feelings. Or if you don't feel comfortable listening, say, do you want me to bring over some chocolate? We can sit outside. Or you know your friend best, or you know your child best. It's okay to say, I don't know what to say. So as a family unit, checking in with each other. I've often found too that men there are roles, right? There are family roles sometimes that are given to us, whether we will like them or not. For example, mothers are typically the caregivers and the housekeepers, and males are the providers, right? These old titles that perpetuate, and some might be true, and some might not be. But I think deep down, there are still those truths to some degree that we're expecting. So, men don't cry. False. In fact, when they do cry, it's I think to recognize how strong they are to cry. And that mothers have to keep things going, have to keep the house clean, have to, there are those truths that do not need to be present in grief. So the more that we can break those stereotypes down, I think the more raw emotion and we uncover, the healthier your grieving journey will look like. we kind of, I think many of you already know this, but here's just a brief review of signs and symptoms of grief. I really love this saying, the only cure for grief is to grieve. If we do not allow ourselves to grieve, we are denying ourselves that emotion and that right to honor that person that has meant so much to us, or that thing that has meant so much to us. And even also, I'm just going to name the elephant in the room. Let's say somebody passes away and they don't mean much to us. We still have an innate being to grieve. So even if we are happy that the person has died, or that the toxicity of that person is no longer present in your life, there is still a level of grieving that needs to be done. Again, the typical signs and symptoms, right, are exhaustion and sleep problems, weight loss, gain. Sometimes a flat affect comes with that. For children, I think what Olivia and I noticed the most sometimes is a withdrawal. And Olivia, please feel free to chime in again, but sometimes there's a withdrawal, sometimes there's a change to a different behavior. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I see a lot of regression. So one of the biggest things I see with preschoolers that are fully potty trained is a death or a loss happens and they revert back to wetting the bed or sucking their thumb, something they haven't done in years. And I know it can be exhausting as a parent to have worked so hard to get potty trained and get to not suck their thumb or use a pacifier, but those are normal physical reactions to death and dying for kids.
Right. Absolutely. Then grief, the ever giving gift, I guess. We go into emotional, psychological, and cognitive effects. So inward, we have outward signs and symptoms, but then we also have inward signs and symptoms. Denial, guilt, anger. Again, depression, anxiety is a big one too that I didn't list on here. Fear of being around people, fear of being around spaces, wanting to be alone, isolated, many, many different ways to experience grief. And then of course we have the social effects too. Again, many people withdraw. Some people actually go further into social lives to numb the pain or the feelings. So it really can go either way. And of course, then we also have the spiritual effects. What does your spirituality or your theology or your belief system, what does it say about death and dying, and what does that mean to you? I think one thing that can really rock people to the core is having this belief system, whether that be a religion or whether that be a universal natural love of the world. And you think that you know how you feel until something happens and it completely knocks you off. And you're thinking to yourself, I thought that I understood this, but this doesn't feel right. This feels terrible. I would like to say too, in my studies and in my own experience, being in that space where you question your God or your spirit or your purpose is healthy and normal as long as you're safe. If you don't feel safe, it is absolutely appropriate to call for help, to call 911, to go to the emergency department. If you are feeling harm to yourself or harm to others, those are signs and symptoms that are not healthy. And sometimes that can happen. Wrestling with those questions and wrestling with that identity is very natural and very normal, although it feels distant and it feels frustrating, living into that. And again, I'm speaking too from personal experience. As a chaplain, many people will say to me, how can you question God, or how can you be angry with God? And for me, the answer is, how could I not be? I'm human. I'm not perfect. I'm not any different than you or anybody else. And I'm angry. I'm sad and I'm angry, and I don't feel like talking to God. I think recognizing that those thoughts that we can have, those can be liberating sometimes. So some myths and some misunderstandings when you are dealing with grief yourself, or when you have a friend or a family member who has gone through death and dying. All losses are the same. This is the big one. I've had many families who have lost a child, especially in the neonatal intensive care unit or in the emergency department. And then you'll have a family member or friend come up and say, yeah, I understand. I lost my grandma 2 years ago. Not the same. And it's so, the meaning and the love are there. I think for everybody, the connectedness is trying to be made here, but recognizing that it's not the same as a child, or pet loss too. That's another one. And sometimes I laugh, but it sometimes it just comes out. I think we've all been there, right? Where we say something, we're like, oh my gosh, shouldn't have said that one. The other common misunderstanding is that grief declines over time. This is actually not the case. Grief, doesn't have a measurement, and it can intensify, or it can be steady. Children grieve like adults. I think if anything, sometimes, and Olivia, I'd love to hear your input too. Sometimes I love listening to the mouth of babes, because I feel like they just put it so succinctly. And I'm like, yes.
Kids have a way of, I like to say, giving it to us honest. And so kids just say exactly what comes to their mind.
Yeah. And sometimes their way of thinking too, like whether that be in I had one child tell me about their understanding of death, was like a villain, right? So the villain came and they took over the happiness of the hero, but the villain's not going to win, and the hero will always come back. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. So, living into those misconceptions, and when you don't know, say you don't know. There are some things I get asked that I don't know. And most importantly, if nothing else, right, the two takeaways from tonight are: be honest, and then also never judge another person's grief. Easier said than done, but living into their reality is raw and it's hard. I don't know if you've ever seen Brene Brown's video on empathy versus sympathy, where I think it's the bear and the fox comes down into the deep dark hole with the bear and just says, I don't know what to say, but I'm here, which is kind of powerful. So what can we do? Give ourselves time and permission. For our children, let them be honest. There's a fine line between perseverating on grief and death and dying, and also recognizing emotions and giving life and love and breath to that. So if you need somebody to help you with that, reach out. Reach out to a counselor. There's many out there, or to one of us if you need any help identifying other places out there. Be genuine and remember that it's okay to not be okay, but it's also okay to not know what to say. And lastly, I wanted to just encourage each of you to, you listen to this whole presentation, so way to go, hard work. But two, give yourself grace. I think universally we can all agree that there's some level of grace out there, and find an appropriate and safe outlet to talk. Friends, families, colleagues, chats. I hesitate on Google because you never know kind of what answers you're going to find, but make sure it fits with you and your family. So I just wanted to quickly go over before we believe we have 15 minutes left. So and Olivia, I know that you might have to head out a little bit. So if you wanted to share your last thoughts, I'm going to talk about resources next and go over some questions.
Yeah, you're good. I don't have to jump out early.
Okay.
One thing I did forget to mention early, but you just reminded me of it when you were talking about like honesty and not knowing what to say. One thing that talked about a lot was what happens in the moment of death and dying. But one thing that I didn't talk about that I just want to touch on is the funeral. Kids ask a lot of questions at funerals. It's really good to prepare kids for what they're going to see and what they're going to hear and who's going to be there and the reactions they could see. I try to prepare kids for as much as I can for when they walk in. And if it's an open casket, if it's a closed casket, if it was a cremation, if there's nothing there, if it's just like a service or like going out to the beach or something, I try to prepare kids because if there's any time for a kid to be honest, it's going to be in a funeral home and they're going to ask those questions when it's absolute silence in the entire place. So just preparing them for what they're going to see and what they're going to hear and letting them know what a funeral is for. I just wanted to touch on that because I did forget to mention it earlier.
No, I'm so glad you did, because I think that those are kind of the sticky questions that probably most people watching are asking. What do you say? What would you say for an open casket?
So a lot of times it depends on kind of reason of death. I've already gone over the conversation with the kid of how that person died. And I explained, so we have a funeral, which is a time for all of everybody who knew Susie to come and to see Susie and to say their goodbye one last time. You're going to see Susie's body, but you should know that Susie's heart's not working, Susie's brain isn't working, her lungs aren't working, it's just her body, and Susie's there. And then I give them options, as many options as I can. Do you want to see Susie? Do you want to touch Susie? Do you want to talk to Susie? So that if they see other people doing it, they kind of might have wished they had the opportunity to do it, or B, be very scared and not want to. And those are all okay emotions, but giving them the options that are appropriate. That's, do you want to sit with your friends during the funeral? Would that be helpful for you? Do you want to sit with your family? So making sure that they're comfortable and giving them those options, I can't express that enough, is giving them choices in a time where everything could be removed choices for them. They didn't choose for this person to pass away, and they didn't choose that they wanted to go to the funeral. So giving them choices, and then just being honest, telling them exactly what they're going to see. Yeah. I know we say it 1,000 times, but
no, me too. It's easier said than done. And also too, I would venture to say, for most children, giving them again the option of whether they want to participate in the funeral. Many kids will astound you. And giving them that option. Do you want to write a poem? Do you want to draw a picture? Do you want to do a dance? Maybe they're really into baseball. Do you want to give a game ball to Joe? So things that might seem odd to you might not be odd to the children. And I would say too, the biggest thing that we also offer that I think is kind of underutilized for death and dying are workbooks, coloring books, journals, books that you can read together as families. And actually, my wonderful Child Life friends gave me a couple that we all use collectively. Before I forget that, if you as a parent or a guardian want anything for yourself, for a child, for a teen, for another family member, your spouse, or grandparents, it's centering.org. It's called the Centering Corporation, and they have pamphlets, they have books, they have workbooks. I actually pulled it up right here. One of my favorites is How I Feel. It is a coloring book for grieving children by Alan Wolfelt. For those experiencing, whether it be a stillbirth or death at birth or shortly after birth, when hello means goodbye. That is one of my go-to books. But then as you'll see, it's again centering.org. There are books for parents and caregivers called Children Grieve Too, Helping Children Cope with Grief. There are, for teenagers, you'll see this resource in a little bit, Fire in My Heart and Ice in My Veins. It's more geared towards the teenage population. For our child life specialist and myself, we do use this book a lot, the Goodbye Book. And again, these are not the end all be all books. These are just some of the recommendations that we have used. This is a very popular one. The Invisible String. If I remember correctly, this had a very like broad understanding of spirituality in it. It might mention God, but you can also cater it to spirits and beliefs. So it's very, very good one. There is also this. Now this is this does have spiritual religious language in it, but I think overall the purpose is good. My Grief Journal. I don't know if you can see that. It's by Laura Deal. But there are other ones too that are not specifically religious or spiritual based. And again, you have these pivotal years. You're probably thinking, oh my gosh, this chaplain is telling me not to buy something spiritual, but it's who I am. You know, I believe that all beliefs are worthy, and that all feelings and all spiritualities, whether you believe in anything or nothing, is valid and beautiful. And if it brings you hope and goodness, follow what you can follow. So if you need to cater that book to whatever beliefs you believe in, it's also a very pivotal age for the kids to realize maybe what they believe in or maybe what they're struggling with. This book goes over a lot of different ways of death. So it might be for an older population. It does talk about, or it does reference, it does reference overdose. But this one might be helpful as well. And then ones that I've written here on the screen, I really love Memories Live Forever. That's a coloring book. I think many ages can use that. And Helping Children Grieve, when someone they love dies. Olivia, do you have any favorites?
You showed all my favorites.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, let me get my screen to work. I think, yes. Okay, so for teens, I didn't put many resources only because I didn't want to specify spiritual versus non-spiritual. I wanted to kind of leave that up to where your teenager is in their own belief system. But Fire in My Heart and Ice in My Veins can be a good one. For adults, again, I would reference the centering.org website. I always love to do my own Google searches to see what's out there. There are many books out there. I encourage you to try and find the right one that fits your family. So I just wanted to go over quickly while we have time. Wanted to share that quote with you. The part that brings me hope, where I find meaning, is know that I live on. And when you need me, just whisper my name in your heart and I will be there. Finding a way to connect with your loved one, whether they are presently here on earth or whether they are not, is something that only you can find out, and it can really bring hope and meaning. I think never closure, because I think we're always have that piece of our heart that's missing to some extent, but just my word of encouragement. So there were some questions that were asked ahead of time, and I just want to bring them up, and Olivia and I will try and answer them to the best of our ability. So the first one I'm going to talk about is murder. How do you help your kids cope when a family member has been murdered? How do you make sense out of a senseless act of violence? Great question. For murder, that's also one of the cases for me in particular that, like Olivia said, I will ask the child, what do you know? What do you feel? And I will let them lead me. Olivia, you probably want to add to that.
Yeah, with some of those like acts of violence or natural disasters, things that are kind of out of the control of anyone, or like I said, acts of violence, it's like Ann said, understand what they know first, because a lot of times kids have seen things on the news, heard things at school, and they may already know. If they don't know, it is completely up to you what you want them to know. It's important that they understand that that person is dead, again, using that word dead. But if you want to tell them and explain, you don't have to use the word murder, but just understanding that. So there was an injury to, I'll say, like if it was a bullet to the head, there was an injury to the brain doesn't work anymore, and this person died. You don't have to tell them it was murder. You don't
Right.
have to tell them that. You tell them what you want to tell them in the most honest way possible.
And also to say, I don't know why this happened. It seems like it's very, it's very hard for us to understand what exactly happened. But the gun, right? The gun has a bullet in it, especially if it's a younger child. The gun has a bullet, and that can really hurt the body and can kill. And again, to reference, like, I'm having a hard time understanding it too, so I'm sure you are too. And then I think a good segue too, Olivia, I don't know if you agree with this, is to say, tell me what you remember about Mary. What are some things that you remember about Mary? Let's talk about that. Bringing it back to the person who passed away, who died. What are some memories that we have of Mary? What are ways that you remember? So keeping the focus on that person of significance, whether it be a sibling or a partner. Good question though. Those are the hard ones, because I think for us too, it doesn't make sense either. One of the other questions is, this is a good one. My child has a loved one with a terminal diagnosis. What are the best ways to encourage them to focus on the time that they have as opposed to the upcoming loss? It's a great question. My initial response would be to acknowledge the loss itself, the death and the dying, that it will come, that we can't avoid it. We cannot. And that there are things, again, it goes back to what you believe in for your own personal family. There are things that we cannot control in terms of the way that the body works sometimes, and the body's reaction to drugs that are supposed to help us, to keep us alive. So as much truth as you can with their developmental stage. Joe has really tried this called chemotherapy, and it's not working. His body isn't receiving it, and that's very hard for all of us because we wish that it had. But unfortunately, his body is not responding to this medication, and it's not working, and he will die, but he wants to spend his last moments with us to celebrate this life that he has. That's just off the top of my head. It could go deeper. It could go a different way. Another question I think that's important, Olivia, I'm going to ask you to do this one, because I know that you and I work with this a lot. How do I tell my daughter that it is okay to talk about their little sister who died 2 years ago? I'm afraid my oldest avoids speaking about her little sister to try and protect me. Then it goes on to say, I don't want her to stop talking about her little sister, just to protect me.
Yeah. So, first off, that's a really good question to ask. So one of the things I would do is sit down with her and say, so how are you feeling about losing your sister? What are your thoughts on that? Why don't you talk about her? Because it may be that she doesn't talk about her sister because she sees that it upsets you, or it may be something completely different. She may be angry. She may have other emotions. So finding out the root of why she's not talking about her first, and then say, the way that I handle mommy, daddy handles it is I cry, but you don't have to. If you want to cry, you can, but if you want to play, if you want to talk. So it's really important to find out where she's at with it, because she could be avoiding the whole situation because she doesn't want to upset you, or she could be avoiding it because she doesn't know how to process it yet. So just asking her and saying, what is it? Like, tell me about, or bringing it up in conversation. So we're eating dinner tonight. Do you think Susie would have liked the mac and cheese? Or what do you think Susie would say right now? Like, bringing her into conversation as a norm, making it feel normal to talk about her and letting her see that you're able to talk about her and that it's okay.
One of the other tactics, I guess, or techniques, if you will, that we learn about in our training too, is using I statements. So like Olivia said, sitting her down, him or her down and saying, you know, I've noticed that sometimes you might want to talk about so-and-so, but I also recognize that I get very upset. And I just wanted to let you know that I really like hearing you talk about this person, even though I get upset. And I also just wanted to let you know that if you want to talk about them, I really want to hear about it. And if you don't want to talk about them, that's okay too. But if you could tell me how you feel, that would really be great when you're ready. So I think there's also a level of not wanting to put them on the spot too. They might not be ready. They might need to process what you said. That might be a lot.
Mhm.
One of the last questions we have is about resources for sibling support for death and dying. I do know that COVID has kind of thrown a wrench into many of the meetings, but I know that Edmark puts on a really great camp, if you will. It's called Piece by Piece, and it's PIECE by PEACE, Piece by Piece. And that's for siblings too who have lost somebody to death and dying. And then Bon Secours, they used to have kids in grief. I'm not sure that I'm not sure where they are on that right now, but those are two resources off the top of my head. I know Jewish Family Services often has lots of resources available. At this time, CHKD, we do not have a sibling support group. We do, however, have a bereaved parent support group that is going on. We are renovating it, making sure that that it is meeting all of the needs for grieving families. So we are taking just a month or two off to restructure. But that is available too. If you are interested in that, please email me, let me know. One thing that I said that I would do is put my email on the last slide, and I forgot to do that. Shame on me. But I am going to share it here in the chat section, and I'm hoping that my information and Olivia's information can be passed on. If you have a pen and paper, it is Anne, ANNE dot Kessner, KESNER at chkd.org. And Olivia, may I share yours too, Olivia? Putting you on the spot. Olivia, OLIVIA dot Vincent, VINCENT at chkd.org. Either one of us can help you, point you in the right direction, or just be a listening ear. If you feel more comfortable to calling, the phone line for the bereavement for my phone line is 757-668-9661. And again, we're here to help you, to be a resource. We might not know it all, but we really do want to listen to you and to be there for you. So thank you guys so much for listening. Olivia, thank you so much for your wisdom. I appreciate you very much. And thank you, whoever's out there, for watching and for listening.
Anne and Olivia, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our families, these tough conversations. We hope that everyone, we have a lot of participants with us this evening. I hope you'll join us for future sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.